Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Sadia Adam. I am the Acting Director of Standards at the IRBA. It is 1 p.m. and welcome to the IRBA webinar, Artificial Intelligence in Finance, Shaping the Future. We hope that you stay with us till 4:30 today, and we are excited to see so many people joining on the session. This is not surprising due to our esteemed lineup of presenters, and we will be hearing from today. Thank you for taking the time to present to us and the time that goes into preparing for a webinar. I can already see 321 people on the call. That's exciting. But let's give the people that are still logging on some time. And during this time, let's test the chat functionality. So our chat function will remain open. And the question that I would like to pose to everyone today is, what do you think is the most popular AI tool for finance professionals? So this may be a guess, or you may want to share on your own experience, and we'll see if the chat function lights up. While we wait for the responses to come through, I've already noted that we have several representatives from outside South Africa and our neighboring countries. Welcome. We have several of our committee members also present on the call. Thank you for joining us today. I am looking towards the chat function, but it seems to be so busy that I can't view it yet. So there might also be a custom tool that your organization would be using. It seems like ChatGPT is very common at the moment. Copilot. So I have a confession. When I tried using AI to look up this tool, depending on which tool I asked, I got a different answer. So maybe this is the survey response we can get. So now that we've noted that the chat function is working, it will be open for the duration of the call. So feel free to engage with our presenters with a comment or a question. And this is what adds value to the presentation and becomes key takeaways. We have bite-sized presentations planned for today. So please do have a notebook and pen handy, as I will be doing as well. And this is what I think that I can give you a heads up for. You will be hearing new words and terminology that you might want to check on later. The presentations may leave you with questions that are unanswered on the presentation, but would be something that you would want to research later on. And if you make a list of everything that you learned new on the call, this is great for encouraging others to view the recording, which will be made available. So now that we have everyone settled in, it is time for the next slide and for me to introduce the IRBA CEO. If you have not met our IRBA CEO, our IRBA CEO is Emre Nagy. Emre has a wealth of experience of over 20 years. He has been leading the IRBA in some of our most recognized projects, as well as he is a member of the International Forum of Independent Audit Regulatory Board, and he has also had some leadership roles there. However, in this presentation, in keeping with innovation, you will be hearing a presentation from Emre of one of its kind. So stay tuned. And over to Emre.
Good afternoon, esteemed participants, colleagues, and friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Artificial Intelligence in Audit Day, hosted by the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors. I'm sorry I can't join the webinar at this time because I'm abroad. I thank you for letting me share my personal message through this AI version of myself. Today we gather here to explore the transformative power of AI and its profound impact on our profession and beyond. I'm delighted to see such a diverse and enthusiastic group of professionals, students, innovators, and thought leaders joining us from different parts of the country and the world. I would like to take a moment to reflect on the significance of artificial intelligence in our industry. AI is not just a buzzword. It is a game changer that is reshaping the way corporate reporting is carried out and the audits thereon conducted. AI is revolutionizing our field in a significant manner, and it is up to all of us to harness this potential responsibly and ethically. At the IRBA, we are committed to staying at the forefront of technological advancements to ensure that we remain relevant in effectively regulating auditors and ensure that we remain fit for purpose well into the future. As recently as last week in Berlin, Germany, I had the privilege of hearing directly from the International Standard Setting Board chairs and the International Forum of Independent Audit Regulators that the use of advanced technology by auditors will be a specific focus area over the next 2 years. The IRBA's mission is to protect the financial interests of the public and ensure that the auditing profession remains relevant and resilient in the face of rapid technological change. Today's webinar is a step towards our strategic aim to foster innovation and collaboration, while we are being mindful of the potential impact on audit quality and the reliability of corporate information prepared using advanced technology. We have an exciting lineup of speakers who will share their insights and experiences on various aspects of AI. They will explore the capabilities and risks associated with the growing use of generative AI and agentic AI, and importantly, explore how professionals can balance innovation with risk mitigation. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished speakers who will share their insights and expertise, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Emre. This is, of course, a fun way of introducing our CEO, and I hope that you see that we've been on themed. I do note that we now have 533 people on the call, and that might be a reason for any slight delays in sound. But this is a presentation that is jam-packed, and I am not going to keep you all any longer. If we can have the slides back up, please, and I can start introducing you to the host for today. So today our host is Rudolf Maleka. Rudolf is a professional manager in the standards department, and when Rudolf interviewed to join the IRBA less than a year ago, he was already speaking about this webinar. So we'll ask Rudolf to come on screen, and I will then hand over to Rudolf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sadia. Today is just one of those days where you get to be introduced by your boss. So I'm Rudolf Maleka. I'm a professional manager in the standards department, where I'm involved in a couple of technology-related projects, and I'm also involved in standard setting initiatives. So I'll be a moderator for today. So as I was preparing for this webinar this morning, I decided to go on Pilot, and I'm excited that when I'm looking at the chat box, Copilot and ChatGPT, they come up as some of the most popular AI applications that are used by professionals. So I went to Copilot this morning and asked, Copilot, why should I find artificial intelligence exciting? And I'm going to read and quote, this is the answer that I got from Copilot. It says, you should be excited about artificial intelligence because it has the potential to revolutionize in the industries, to enhance efficiency, drive innovation, and ultimately improve our quality of life. So colleagues, anything that has the potential to improve our quality of life should make us excited, should get us excited. And this is the reason why I'm excited for this webinar. I'm looking forward to insights that will be shared by our great speakers, experts in the field of artificial intelligence, and I hope you're just as excited as I am. So can you please move to the next slide? We're going to have 2 sessions. The event is going to be split into 2 sessions. We're going to have session 1. Our opening speakers will be Sean Barrington and Kevin Pather, and then Jason Bradley will be our next speaker, and then he'll be followed by Lucian Peace. From there, we're going to have a 15 minutes comfort break, and then we're going to jump into session 2. Can you please go to the next slide? Okay, in the second session, Evelyn Moodley will open the second session, and will be followed by Eric Cohen. From there, Howard Sneeman will take over, and Jeremy Justin will be our last speaker for the day. From there, we're going to have a 5 minutes conclusion and remarks. So Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of how the program is going to run, each speaker will be allocated 20 minutes to do their presentation. And at the end of that presentation, we're going to have a 5 minutes Q&A. And depending on whether time permits, we can ask 1 or 2 questions. And if time does not allow, we are not going to have a session for Q&A. But however, you are allowed and encouraged to put your questions in the chat box. At the end of the presentation, the speakers will come back and respond to your questions. And from there, just a reminder, we're going to have a 15 minutes comfort break. So can you please move to the next slide? So our very first speakers for the day is Sean Barrington. Sean Barrington is a partner at EY, and he's also the head of technology for EY Africa. Sean is accompanied by Kevi Pather. Kevi Pather is also a partner at EY, and is the head of artificial intelligence for EY Africa. Sean and Kevi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rudolph, and good afternoon, everyone. Really good to meet you. And in the preparation for this conference, Kavi and myself spent quite a bit of time reflecting, and we have the fortunate privilege of being able to spend a lot of time with a lot of our clients over the course of the last 12, 18 months. And wow, what an 18 months it's been. So what we're going to spend a little bit of time on is just reflecting on what we've seen in the industry, literally over the last 12 months or so, a shift into the art of the possible in terms of where we see AI going. And then Kavi's going to run through a quick demo, really reflecting on possibly a simple use case, but just talking about how AI and agentic AI is really starting to impact the lives of all of us today. If we can go to the next slide, we'll then kick off a little bit of a history in terms of how we've seen AI shifting over the last 12, 18 months. And when I say yesterday, Kavi will joke about it just now, but yesterday is literally probably December last year, right? And if we see how things have shifted quite radically over the last kind of 12 months as a reflected, it's quite impressive. And if we go back to yesterday, everyone's heard about the large language models, ChatGPT, Copilot as a component of them. And where everyone was effectively a year ago is talking about these large language models. I'm sure all of us played asking stupid questions, trying to trick the tool, but a lot of us were in that experimental phase, and a lot of organizations were actually just too scared to use AI. What we saw was a lot of organizations putting a lot of governance, putting a lot of restrictions. And I think, in fact, a lot of organizations actually started to block a lot of those tools because they were just too scared to use them. Speaking to the respondents on this phone, on this call, and I'm probably putting words in your mouth, but we saw a lot of our clients, and I'm speaking on your behalf as well, actually just being too scared to use these tools. What's then started to happen is we started to see a bit of a shift. We're all starting to talk about it over barbecues, braais, over dinners, over lunches. And all of us have started to pivot a little bit towards, okay, I now can understand where this AI tool is coming from. I now understand what it's capable of. And what we've started to see is organizations starting to move to value case use cases. One of the points I didn't talk about on yesterday is we also saw a lot of our clients, when I'm talking about last year, focusing on technology over use cases. So what we saw in the yesterday is a lot of our clients going out to buy tools and capabilities, but not really understanding how to use AI. So just coming back to today, what we've now seen is a fundamental and radical shift away from technology from an AI point of view and large language models from an AI point of view to what we call this value case-based adoption of AI. And what does that mean? Is it means taking a step back, understanding the problems in your organization, and really then trying to make sure that you use value cases and use cases to solve AI. The most common example, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with on this phone, is on finance. But how do you improve a close process? How do you improve reconciliation processes? How do you start to do better financial reporting? How do you start to do better commentary? And what we've seen across all of our clients is that shift, as I said, away from a technology-led approach to a value-cased approach. Now, what's nice about that is the value case approach actually becomes technology agnostic, and I'm sure Kavi will reflect on it now, but there's just so many tools and so many capabilities that the technology is effectively capable of everything. And the value case use case really helps to start to connect those views in a way that starts to orchestrate an outcome. Now, because organizations are moving towards that value use case, we've also started to see governance loosen up a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, governance is very, very, very important, but governance is not a one-size-fits-all. A Copilot, relatively well-governed, relatively well-controlled, relatively well-restricted, but an open source GitHub or anything else has a whole risks on itself, and it's really important that you start to really adapt the use cases based on the specific needs and the specific outcomes. But maybe, Kavi, do you want to talk about the art of tomorrow and what you're seeing coming in the future?
Thanks, Sean. Yes, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So in terms of tomorrow, obviously no one has a crystal ball, and there is a large funnel of uncertainty. But I think there are a few things that are definitely becoming clear, and definitely some technology that's starting to emerge that we can definitely place some bets on. Firstly, I'd say is the current tools, everything that Sean has mentioned, will continue to improve in sophistication and capability. We're already seeing language models and chatbots that the large providers, OpenAI and others, have been producing are moving from essentially just a chat interface and a language model wrapper to a full-blown product. And that product is capable of not just the chat, but also multimodal. So being able to generate images. You might have seen a lot of the trend on social media recently, and even then video. I think from a client perspective, what we're seeing a lot of corporates start to think about, and I think this will definitely be a theme in the future, is moving from an individual value case or use case perspective to actually a portfolio. So rather than here's an interesting point solution which I can deploy, which might save someone 20 or 30% of their time, or maybe even more than that. It's actually thinking about, well, here's a portfolio of use cases and value cases. And this is how I transform my entire finance function, not just that individual workflow or the like. That's definitely a theme for tomorrow. Also, thinking then about how AI will fit into a broader digital strategy. We're seeing a number of clients start to refresh their digital strategies, think about the future, and you can't think about the future without thinking about how AI might fit into that broader picture. And there are definitely challenges and uncertainties in that view. One of the things is just how fast these models are developing. That makes it quite challenging to know what customers will demand, and exactly what capabilities we should be investing in. From a technology perspective, again, another buzzword you might have heard all on social media is agents. So we move from essentially what are primarily contained language models, often in a chatbot or some other use case, to a place where these models can now start to interact with the world. And there's a lot of talk and uncertainty about exactly what agents are and how they relate to the current models. And in my view, it's all part of a spectrum. But for me, what makes agents interesting is not just the fact that they are able to use APIs and interact with other tools, but it's also the fact that these agents can actually design workflows on the fly by themselves. So what that means is, if you come out of a traditional, automation mindset, very, RPA, intelligent automation took the view that, if you can define the workflow, we can possibly automate it, because we can essentially set up an algorithm to perform the work of a human. What the new agentic AI capability really affords companies is to skip the step where we actually code that workflow. Essentially, the AI is in charge, and it can develop the workflow on the fly. If it encounters a problem halfway through, it can pivot and self-correct. And I think that opens up a whole host of different possibilities. In the future, probably not too distant future, these agentic AI capabilities will then evolve even further into developing a self-learning capability, and that will mean that we would be able to not just develop and execute workflows on the fly, but actually these models are able to learn. And the use cases that open up beyond that are actually quite difficult to even think about now. I think the overarching theme is certainly that we're just at the beginning of this AI revolution. And while companies try and figure out strategies and ways to incorporate the technology, we definitely need to be keeping an eye on how it's moving and the developments that are happening day to day. With that, I'm going to move into the demo. And so if we could go to the next slide and play it, and if I could also ask that we pause it from time to time, just so that I can voice it over properly. So just before we begin, really what we wanted to demonstrate is just a use case that we've developed globally around third-party risk management. So really, this is many companies, many of our clients have the need to evaluate third parties and to consider the risk they may pose to their organizations. Often that involves quite a detailed assessment, a risk questionnaire of sorts, looking at various data sources that company would submit, and really performing a risk assessment on that company. It's often very manual, very time consuming, because there are quite a number of documents to go through. And what you'll see in the demo is basically through the use of agentic AI, we've been able to automate that process to a very large extent. So with that, if you could play the video. I'll just wait for the intro to complete. We've turned the sound off for it. Okay, so if you pause here, the very first step you'll see is really creating an environment. So the user basically creates an isolated and secure data space dedicated exclusively to that client, and this ensures strict confidentiality and clear separation of sensitive information. Maintaining an isolated environment really safeguards the client and meets rigorous compliance standards for privacy and security. And this is fundamental when implementing any AI use case. So if you could play again, please. Okay, pause here. Next, you'll see we can easily define an assessment target, which represents the third-party entity under review. And managing documents is quite straightforward. So we simply click Manage within the Documents tile and select the necessary files to be provided. And within minutes, the AI system will essentially process all of those documents, making data instantly available without any need to manually review them. So please play. Okay, a pause here, please. So the virtual assistant is now is the core powerhouse of the application. By clicking Start in the conversational tile, you'll see the user essentially initiate a chat interface. The chat interface is quite intuitive, allows the user to ask pretty much any question, and it will draw from those documents and essentially answer those questions. But quite crucially, you'll see it provide references as well. And you can quite easily click on those references to verify what the AI is telling you, and delve deeper into some of those questions. So please press play.
Avi, while we just in quiet, why don't we just talk a little bit about what's happening in the background as well?
Sure. If we just pause here. So yeah, obviously in the background, what's happening is the AI is taking the query, essentially searching through all of those documents, and finding the relevant information. It then pulls that information out, and feeds it back into the language model, along with the question, and that's how we're essentially able to generate an answer. But next, we're going to see a functionality called bulk Q&A, and really this is where it comes into its own. So what bulk Q&A really allows us to do is bulk process a questionnaire. So traditional methods struggle with extensive questionnaires, so you're limited by the number of questions you can actually fit into the chatbot. And this is where the agentic functionality comes in, because essentially what the agent is doing is looking through that questionnaire and breaking it up into parts, ideally questions, and working through those questions one by one with the documents in the background. So you can upload your questions via CSV, and that questionnaire can be as long as you like. The AI basically immediately analyzes the knowledge base, and generates responses to all of those questions with references, and the responses can then be validated directly in the app. So if we press play, we can watch the AI do exactly that. So you'll see the user click upload under bulk Q&A in a second. Now obviously, sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No, carry on.
I was going to say, traditional LLMs, there have been many tools that are able to do a similar kind of thing. But the real innovation here is those tools are often limited, one, by the number of documents you can analyze, but two, and most importantly, the number of questions, and the length of response to those questions. So essentially, the real innovation here is leveraging agentic AI to be able to analyze an arbitrary number of questions in detail, and still provide the same level of detail and response. And you can see this is the result of the questionnaire. You can see all the questions listed there with the responses, and the user can click through and analyze. So if we just pause for a second, the last thing I'd say about this is really, obviously you can then export that information into any format that you like, and really the value here is, of course, the time saved. So often these kinds of questionnaires would take someone a week to complete, and this can now be done in minutes. But secondly, and often not thought about, it's the consistency and quality that's being solved. A manual process relies on humans, relies on training procedures. When people leave, you have to retrain them and the like. With a tool like this, you manage that consistency quite well as well. So if we can play the outro. The last comment I'll make, just in closing, is as I mentioned, a theme really around tomorrow is that we're just at the beginning of this revolution. I think one of the things we're seeing in the market is the challenge for clients is that there's a lot of uncertainty, and so you really need an agile strategy when it comes to AI. And finally, the pace of change is accelerating. So you thinking about how you can do this in an agile way becomes extremely important.
And Kavi, I guess just coming back to the point that you made 30 seconds ago, is the ability to shorten this from a week down to a couple of hours. I know we often talk about EY being client zero for a lot of these things. I know we actively use this tool from an internal risk management point of view. And I think we found a massive degree of improvement in quality of research, because typically humans will miss websites, they'll miss sources, they'll miss inputs, they'll misinterpret, but also faster turnaround. Maybe just if there's specific use cases on us as client zero or references on us as client zero, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, we use it day to day. As EY, before we take on any clients, we do these kinds of assessments, and we used to have, a large team and a nearshoring capability essentially doing this. Now that team is a lot more efficient, and can take on a lot of other responsibilities as well. So we first tested it out on ourselves, And now that it's ready, we're actually taking it out to the market and to our clients.
Thanks so much, Kavi. Rudolf, we're happy to open up for a bit of a Q&A. I know you've got a couple of prepared questions as well.
Thank you very much, Sean and Kavi. That was a great presentation. Obviously, when you talk about this AI application, as someone that works in the standard setting department, we read a whole lot of documents, we process a whole lot of information, and I see great value in this application in that it can reduce your time from reading a document for 2 weeks, reducing it to a few hours. I see great value in that. But now I have a question. If I was to use this AI application for processing information, to analyze and process information, which measures do you think I should take into account before I can rely on that the output produced by the AI system, that it's accurate and reliable?
So
go for it, Kavi.
Sorry, Sean. My response to that is the key measure. They're quite a number, but really the key measure is at this point, there's always a human in the loop. I don't think we're at a stage with AI yet where it can be just unleashed unsupervised. So that's why with this tool, the way that it references responses and is then able to, and the human can then go through and verify those responses, is actually quite critical to making it a success and making it practical. Sorry, Sean.
And no, spot on, Kavi. You've answered the question, but there's another perspective here as well, right? So the advantage around our models is you actually have the opportunity to train it and teach it when things go wrong. And it's got to really be an immersive experience to make sure that the content is trained and the content is relevant. I was actually at a conference last week where a similar question came up, Rudolf. Your AI tools will be as generic as the input that's given to it. And what we'd recommend all of our clients is, 1, human in the loop, Kavi, but 2, make sure that you actually invest the time in making sure that the tool is conditioned to respond to the context that you give it. Even Copilot, if you start to load documents into it before you ask a series of questions, you'll find that you get a lot more specific answer in the long run.
Thank you so much, Sean and Kavi. And my last question for you. So what I like is that when you started your presentation, you spoke about how our mindset and our attitude towards artificial intelligence has changed over time. So, and I remember when these conversations around the use of artificial intelligence, some of the ethical concerns were about whether AI is going to replace human beings. And as a finance professional, I'm worried. I don't want to be replaced by artificial intelligence. And just an advice, how would you advise a finance professional to go about their attitude towards artificial intelligence so that they can benefit and leverage off it? Back to you, Sean and Kavi.
You go for it, Kavi.
Yeah, absolutely. So the saying that's now a little bit cliche is, I think that it's not AI that's going to replace insert profession. So accountants and auditors in this case. It's really accountants and auditors using AI that will replace those who don't. And I think as cliched as it is, it really holds true. So the key thing for me, and this is what we generally encourage all of our staff to do here at EY, and we've implemented Copilot and other AI tools to encourage this, is really to encourage people to learn about AI, to play with it, and then to find ways of using it in their day-to-day life, because day-to-day work, because that's really what's going to make you more efficient, and also ensure the longevity of your career.
Maybe, Rudolf, I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. You happy if I just spend 2 minutes going through them? So Kavi, I'll read them to you, and if you just want to answer, that would be great. So the first 2 questions are very closely linked. It talks about where does the documents come from, and how long is it stored? And generally speaking, is it widely public information? Maybe you just want to spend 2 seconds reflecting on that.
So very often this is public information, and certainly in the use case that we used it internally for our client assessments, it was adverse media that we were dealing with in that case. And so that was publicly available information. As the tools evolved and we've managed to make it or to create secure environments with it, essentially that allows us to upload confidential information as well, and that adheres to our global standards around client-facing tools and client technologies, and our policies around document retention and the like.
And maybe just to build on that a bit, Kavi, I guess it comes back to the agent conversation you were talking about up front, right? You can point at whatever source you want to get it from, and it can source the public web, it can source law cases, it can source any documents you want.
Absolutely.
And provided it's within a container set up by yourselves, it will retain that information as confidential as need be. But if there are any questions, Rudolf, I'm sure you've distributed our contact information. More than happy to have follow-ups with the individuals on the call.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean and Kavi. I'm now going to call upon our next speaker. Can you please move to the next slide? Our next speaker is Jason Bradley. Jason is a founding member of the IASBA Technology Working Group. He's from IASBA. I will be handing over to Jason. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Rudolf. Can we move on to first? Thanks. So the topic of my session today is going to be looking at the IASBA code, so the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants code, and thinking about some practical considerations when it comes to ethics and technology. As an, obviously as a member of the technology experts group, it's a matter that's close to my heart, and it's something that I think is very important when we think about how we use AI, when we think about how we use data analytics and other kinds of emerging technology, is sometimes in the rush to deploy things and implement, we kind of can collectively forget a little bit about some of our core kind of fundamental principles that we sign up to as accountants, as members of professional bodies. We are beholden, as it were, to ethical codes, ethical standards, depending on which groups you're a member of. So the focus for me today is to talk a little bit about some recent revisions to the IASBA code that focused on technology, and to look at a couple of practical case studies and a couple of examples of instances where using technology could go wrong from an ethical standpoint, and what firms could do to think about the best way to kind of mitigate that, to set up systems to help them prevent those issues occurring, but also to look at how we can take action if there are problems, how those can be remediated, and how we can make sure that as technology usage increases and is more adopted by the industry and by auditors, tax advisors, and everything else that accountants do, we're doing it in a way which is both professionally, ethically sound, and also make sure that what we're delivering to clients is the best quality that it can be, delivered in a way which protects them from some of the issues and challenges that can arise with emerging technologies. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thanks. I'll start. For hopefully most people on the call will be vaguely aware of the IASBA code. It might be, if you're a member of, your country's institute or chartered body, you probably sign up to some version of this code. Most of the codes, for example, I'm a member of the ICAEW and the Hong Kong Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Both of their codes of ethics are based on the IASBA code and with some local adoption. But the IASBA code is set by IASBA, and it's designed to create a set of ethical standards for professional accountants. Unlike some other codes of ethics in some other jurisdictions, rather than being particularly rules focused, the IASBA code is very principles based. So it's very much about what are the core ethical principles. So that's covered by part 1. And then it does go on to set some specific rules in part 2 and 3 around accountants in business and accountants in public practice. And that's also a very important point that we try to make, is that the IASBA code is also relevant to accountants in business as well as public practice. Most of what I'm going to talk about is about accountants within a public firm, but it's equally applicable to accountants in business as well. I'm also going to talk most explicitly, given the kind of theme of today, about recent revisions for technology-focused work. So from the technology experts group and through public consultation, a number of amendments were made to the code to cover off some really specific technology bits. So to give you another example of that kind of balance of principles and rules, principles we think is a good approach to ethics, full stop, but it is also a good approach to technology and ethics. If you were to set two rules-focused an approach to dealing with technology when it comes to thinking about professional ethics, you kind of create yourself a problem, because if you say, don't use this specific tool or do use this specific tool, by the time a international standard has gone through the process of consultation, it's gone through the process of being published and guidance has been produced, we're talking a period of at least a year, more like 2 in most instances, sometimes longer than that. In the fast-moving kind of pace of technological solutions, that's just not going to be quick enough. So a principles-based approach is more adaptable and more flexible. That means that we can respond to issues on that principles basis rather than having to wait to set specific rules and procedures. We do have some specific rules, though, around technology. One that's very specific is a prohibition on firms that are auditing public companies from hosting their clients' data. So there are in there some very specific rules, but generally we're looking at a principles-based approach. Can you do the next slide, please? Before I kind of dive into the technology side of things, I'll just kind of, again, these 5 fundamental principles are hopefully things that everybody here is aware of in some form or another. But the AISB Code effectively orients around 5 core fundamental principles: integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior. As I've noticed there, they do apply universally, including with emerging technologies and artificial intelligence. The 2 we tend to most focus on when we think about using emerging technologies and looking at how artificial intelligence fits in for professional accountants is generally professional competence and due care. Questions related to that are things like, if you are using an AI tool in your audit or in your tax preparation work or your accounts preparation work, if you're in public practice, or even if you're using an AI tool at your job as a chartered accountant, if you're an FC or an FD, there's an obligation from a professional competence perspective to make sure that you're doing your work properly. So if you're using an AI tool to assist you with large portions of that, it becomes quite a complex question, because what do you need to know as an accountant about the tool? You've got to know enough about what the tool is doing to be able to feel comfortable using it to do your work, particularly if, let's say you're an auditor in the US, you're doing work for you're doing audits of public companies that are registered with the SEC. They're very stringent about the kind of work that's done. So an auditor would need to be able to justify why they'd used a tool in a particular circumstance. So professional competence and that due care element is really important when thinking about AI. And it's about striking a careful balance. Obviously, not everyone can be an AI expert. Nobody's saying that all accountants need to go and all retrain as AI specialists and experts. But at the same time, it's not sufficient to just say, oh, the tool said this, so I've just taken it as read. There needs to be a balance of what can a tool provide to me as a professional accountant, and how much do I need to make sure I can interrogate that, understand sufficiently what the tool is doing, so that I can use that to make decisions in a way which makes sure I meet this fundamental principle. The other big one that we talk about a lot is confidentiality. So confidentiality, is about making sure that you don't disclose your client's information to people. So, the previous speakers touched on it a little bit when they talked about, using what data you do and don't use when it comes to thinking about training models, for example. So a big question at the moment that's been asked in a lot of jurisdictions is, when can you and when can you not use clients' data to help train your own models? So if you're one of the larger firms who is looking to deploy an AI tool within your audit practice, you might want to take an already existing data set you have, lots and lots of information about your clients, and use that to train your tool to help with anomaly detection, pattern detection, looking for fraud or other kind of outliers in data sets. But there's a huge ethical question about when it is and is not appropriate to use client data to train models, because that data belongs to that client. So you've got to think about those confidentiality aspects with it. Again, we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's really kind of a really crucial point at the minute. A lot of people are doing a lot of work kind of legally and from a risk perspective at firms as well to work out where that line sits. Can we go to the next slide, please? So now I've kind of talked over some of the general elements of the IASB code, thinking about that principles-based approach, but with some specific rules in certain circumstances. I'll talk a little bit about the technology-focused revisions. So they're up now and they are effective now, and they were published back in April 2023. The technology-focused revisions on the code is about clarifying some responsibilities with regards to technology. And it's about building a little bit on that framework so it reflects what modern accountants are doing. Something that people said before we started to look at this, and this is true to a certain extent for auditing standards, so it's something that the IAASB are looking at from an audit standard perspective, as well as the IASB are looking at from an ethical standards perspective, is even the principles-based standards were put together in the context of quite a traditional view of how accountants work. As technology alters how accountants do their work, there needs to be a bit of a rethink sometimes about how those principles apply in specific circumstances and when a rule may or may not be appropriate. And that was the kind of genesis of these technology-focused revisions, was to say, well, we've got the principles, sure, they do work, but there may be some instances where we could support firms better and provide clearer kind of context around what's expected when it comes to using technology, artificial intelligence in particular. I won't kind of bore you guys by going through every single line of what's changed and what hasn't changed, because that's all up on the IASB website, but it's kind of focused in three main areas. The first was on heightened risk awareness. So making sure that accountants were cognizant of how using technology changes risk. So what were the intended consequences of using the tool? And what are some of the unintended consequences of using technology? So the focus really there was on thinking about the challenges and emphasizing that the accountant needs to be very aware of what the tool does, why they might be using that tool, and how it's going to help them do their work. You can't take a passive role and just say, oh, I took Copilot or I took ChatGPT or any other tool I've purchased and I've just started using it. It's too passive. And really the idea there was to push people towards a more active way of thinking about the risks involved in using tools. Thinking much more about emphasizing professional skepticism, professional judgment. So really reinforcing the requirements around if you're using the output of a tool. So there's a whole section now on thinking about how to use the output of a tool. Includes some specific AI bits, but it would also cover, outputs from more traditional data analytics tools. What do you need to do as an auditor? What's the mindset you need to be in when that information drops out of that tool? And again, it's about pushing people away from that passive view of, well, I put this information into the AI tool, it said this was a problem, so it must be. Bearing in mind potential bias in data sets, inaccuracies and hallucinations and tools that are used, and myriad other issues that you can encounter when you're using emerging technologies, it's important that professional accountants are appropriately skeptical. And that's not saying that people should be intrinsically distrustful of everything that comes out of an AI-driven tool, but it's about being realistic about what tools are capable of now, what the quality of the output is like, and how useful it actually is on a day-to-day basis. So really those kind of revisions were focused on making sure people engaged their brain when they were using these kinds of technologies and thought about, practically speaking, it's a helpful tool, but it isn't replacing years and years of professional experience that an accountant might have. And then I want to touch a little bit on competence and training. So about accountants making sure that they stay on top of the skills that they need to have to use these kinds of tools and technologies. And again, the focus there is on thinking about, from a principles-based perspective, what do I need to know? What do I need to do my job? And it also kind of emphasizes and reinforces a conversation that's been going on for a few years around people at different levels might need to know different things. What an engagement team member needs to know about what a tool does is probably quite different to what an engagement partner needs to know about what a tool does. Everyone needs to know something. And what this is about is thinking about, well, how do I as a firm decide what's my kind of hierarchy Who needs to know what? Well, maybe I've got my specialists developing tools. Obviously, they need the full mathematical understanding of how a tool is working. But maybe the engagement team level, they are more focused on, okay, how does it work practically? What does my data set need to look like? How do I get a successful result from this? And engagement partners, again, might be another level abstracted above that, where their understanding is about when it is and is not appropriate to have used the output to conclude overall on financial statements. Can we move to the next slide, please? For the next few slides, then, what I'm going to do is focus a little bit on thinking about it kind of practically. So thinking about it from a kind of case study level, I come with a couple of scenarios that have been discussed in working groups. I know firms have talked about these as well. And I know that these are kind of hot button topics when it comes to using AI tools. And the first is about over-reliance. So this kind of scenario is a bit abstracted, but there are lots of similar scenarios that people have come across or discussed. And it's about over-relying on the outputs. So, you know, an example here could be that accounting firms used some kind of automated testing, and they've simply relied on the output without a thorough review. They haven't reviewed it properly. They haven't necessarily looked at why there may be errors in a data set. So really then the issue here is that over-reliance, that over-trust in the system, in this scenario, means that a material misstatement has been not detected. So the core issue from an ethical perspective is that over-reliance compromised quality, created an issue from an integrity perspective potentially as well, and resulting in poor outcomes that are not in the public interest. Professional competence and due care, professional skepticism we touched on as well, some important issues. And really the ethical kind of dilemma or question is really what should the firm have done to help mitigate over-reliance and AI limitations? So the key one we mentioned in the previous slide really is training. And I'm sure all the speakers here today would emphasize the fact that making sure that people using the tools, using AI on a day-to-day basis, are aware of what it is able to do and are cognizant and aware of what it is not able to do. That they understand what should go into a tool, that they understand the kind of quality of data that's required to get a reasonable output, and that they understand that the output is still just an output from a tool, and it is the responsibility of the person using that information to make sure that it is sufficiently helpful. Think about an audit of financial statements. In the end, whatever else happens, the engagement partner signs that audit report at the end, so they are responsible for that engagement. It's not possible for them to say, oh, but this AI tool produced this output, so it's not really my fault. We relied on the AI tool. Ultimately, though, it still sits with the firm and the engagement partner to be responsible for how that engagement is conducted. Underneath that, you know, people doing this work on a day-to-day basis need to be responsible for the decisions that they make and how they use these kinds of tools and technologies. So thinking about training is really important. Thinking about integration is really important. So if you're going to use these kinds of tools, thinking about how it integrates into, you know, the audit methodology that a firm already has, how it integrates into the processes and systems that a firm has. Because where you can sometimes come across greater issues is where a tool is kind of just tacked onto the side. It's not necessarily seen as a proper integral part. And so people can struggle there with how seriously they should take a tool and how much they should or shouldn't be using it. So it's really kind of over-reliance is a big issue because there are many things AI is excellent at. There are many things that machine learning tools will be particularly helpful with things like pattern recognition. But it's not a silver bullet that solves all the problems for audit. And over-relying on those kind of things can create all kinds of problems that are potentially going to create issues going down the line. Can we move to the next slide, please? So to give you a kind of rough practical example of this that I thought was quite amusing, I asked ChatGPT, I said, well, could you summarize for me, for a conference speech I've got coming up, the 5 fundamental principles from the IASB Ethical Code and create me a nice diagram for it? And the ChatGPT confidently presented me with this diagram, which it claimed was an excellent representation of the IASB Code. Thankfully, I didn't rely on this in any way, let alone over-rely on it, for part of a the presentation today, and I've included it more just for comic effect than anything, because if you look at the output of this, at a kind of rough distance, it sort of looks a bit like a diagram you might expect on ethics. There's some kind of flow charts, there's kind of, mind map type scenarios, but it's complete gibberish. It's not even IASB's missing the E for a start, and the rest of it is total nonsense. And all this is quite an extreme example. It does go to show that relying on an output of a tool and actually looking at what it's given you and seeing whether it's in any way vaguely reasonable is very, very important. Can we move on to the next section, please? So I mentioned, and we've talked a little bit about professional competence and due care, about applying professional skepticism, making sure you know enough about the tools you're using to be able to make informed decisions. The other big area I mentioned, and probably the other big fundamental principle outside professional competence, is confidentiality. So confidentiality is a huge issue when it comes to the use of AI tools. And I know a lot of firms have been very nervous about this. Some people in the initial days of sort of ChatGPT emerging kind of just banned it altogether. They said, please don't use it. Don't use it on our systems. We'll put blockers on it. Some companies I know still don't allow people to use ChatGPT. Part of the reason for that is it's not particularly clear, depending on how you've set the model, depending on what API access you have, localized it, and our previous speakers talked about how you can ring fence a model from a kind of public version of it. You can do those kinds of things, but they're a little bit complicated. You need to understand the processes. Just the generic available language models you can get online, so ChatGPT, Lambda, other OpenAI tools, Claude, all those kinds of language models. They are not things you would want to put confidential client data into, because that data, how it gets to where it goes, how it's used, how it then is used to retrain the model, are all complex areas, and they're ultimately all issues that cause big problems from a confidentiality perspective. It's a potential breach of confidentiality if data is accessible to external parties, and by putting it into a language model, you probably are making it accessible to external parties in some way, shape, or form. Not necessarily directly extractable, but certainly could be in some context. Later on, queries could generate information that includes confidential information. So it's quite complex, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that confidentiality is very important from a client aspect. And this scenario, using chatbots to draft client reports, using it to draft financial statements and including things like that, and putting in confidential data is a huge issue, and it's something that's cropped up across a lot of different industries. Ultimately, what can a firm do about it? Well, obviously, the extreme end of the spectrum would be to ban language models. Some firms took that step initially, some have rode back from that now, some have created a more kind of nuanced and balanced approach to it. Some firms have developed isolated models where they can put confidential data in, because it is ring fenced. It doesn't then feed back into the kind of public training of that model. But that's costly. It involves spending money. It's not a free use case to do that kind of thing. So it's about kind of balancing those efficiency gains, trying to get the efficient stuff out without breaching confidentiality and without over using them where it's not. Go to the next slide, please. Next couple of slides are really just kind of summation slides as I kind of work through the last bit and hopefully leave a little bit of time for any questions. So we talked a little bit about professional competence. So what does it actually mean, and what should auditors be doing? I mean, it's about maintaining sufficient knowledge of technology, including AI. When I say including AI algorithms, as I say, I don't mean learn all the underlying maths for how to train a language model, but it's about understanding what a model is good at. Different language models are good at different things. They are built to do different things. I mentioned, for example, OpenAI have some different AI models. O1 and O3 are their more like academically oriented models. They are ones that are a bit more considered in their responses. So if you were to ask a question of ChatGPT and you would ask a question of the O1 model, they're using a similar data set, a similar data source, but O1 will take a lot longer to provide you with the answer because it reasons more before it generates the language. So those kind of models might be more appropriate in certain scenarios. Other models are better at other things. Some are better at coding, some are better at rationalization. So it's about understanding what tool is good to achieve, what tool is the most capable to help you achieve what you want to achieve. It's about continuous learning, and it's about really understanding the threats and the opportunities from AI. Building the safeguards, identifying threats and building safeguards is a kind of core fundamental part of the ethics approach from the IASB side of things. Go to the next slide, please. Confidentiality and data privacy. Even in cloud-based environments, it's important to think about confidentiality. Just because something is all in the cloud doesn't mean it's all encrypted or it's all, secured properly. And so when you're uploading information to cloud environments, again, it's very important people are cognizant and aware of what are the security measures that are in place around that cloud environment. Control environments. Firms spend a lot of time looking at controls for clients, but firms also need to have their own controls in place. So implementing robust controls around who can access client data, what can be done with client data, where it can be copied, and how it can be uploaded into things is really important. And thinking about privacy considerations in model training and usage. So again, thinking a little bit about what can I do from a data training perspective? Can I use my client's data? Can I not? Have I got their permission? Even if I've got their permission, what is it appropriate to do? What is it not appropriate to do with their data? So I've really tried to emphasize, I think, some of the core aspects from a fundamental principles perspective. And I'd say a major takeaway is to really think about professional competence and due care and confidentiality as the big kind of ethical issues. Do you know enough about the tool you're using to be able to use it? Thinking about how competent you feel you may be with it. And that's at an individual as well as a firm level. About due care, so how to use the outputs of that tool carefully to help you do your work. Over-reliance relates to that due care concept, and I think is a really interesting interaction. And then confidentiality is a huge thing. What data are you putting into a model? Should you be putting that into the model? And how do you make sure that your engagement team members and the people that work at a firm are not including loads of confidential private information, when they shouldn't be? Can the last slide, please? And so I think if I was to, kind of just, again, circle back to the kind of overall principles-based approach when it comes to thinking about professional ethics and technology, it's kind of always following the same 4 steps that IASB set out for everything. So, these are not specific to technology, but these are really the core steps. And it's about identifying the threats to your integrity, your independence, your confidentiality, seeing how significant they are, because that will help you determine how significant your safeguards should be. A hugely significant potential issue around confidentiality probably needs a really robust system of safeguards and controls in place. So evaluating the significance of the threats, building up the safeguards, and then, asking yourself as a firm, well, does this solve the problem? Does it need escalation? Do I need to talk to an ethics partner? Do I need to talk to my central team at the firm to get a better understanding of how I can use these tools ethically? I can use these tools in a way which benefits the firm and the clients ultimately. I think go to the last slide is for our questions. So hopefully that gave you kind of idea of the core aspects of the IASB code, both at a kind of fundamental level, but also at a kind of more detailed level when it comes to thinking about technology. Rudolf, I don't have any questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time for Q&A, but just to confirm, in South Africa, we do adopt the IASB code. So your presentation was quite helpful, especially to the professional accountants and auditors in the room, in terms of the practical considerations when applying the principles in the code, especially in the context of emerging technologies and artificial intelligence. Thank you so much, Jason. We're now going to move to our next speaker. Can you please move to the next slide? Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Lucien Peace. Lucien is a director at PPM Artenis, and he also happens to be a member of the Committee for Auditing Standards here at the IRBA. Over to you, Lucien.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Rudolf. Jason, enjoyed that. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to speak a little about the legal side, legal developments as far as AI is concerned in South Africa. So before we get into that, if we can just move to the next slide, I'm sure all of you have in one way or another dealt with some of the programs or some of the tools that I'm going to touch on after this. But as far as the discussion is concerned, we're going to look at what AI is, what are South Africa's laws or the guidelines that might apply as far as AI is concerned, and are there any other applicable laws that impact on your use of AI in South Africa? We're then also going to touch on whether there are any AI-related audit rules. And we're going to look at a very interesting case study, which, as much as it relates to some lawyers who got into a bit of a pickle, the principles that applied in that instance are certainly going to apply to yourselves as auditors as well. And then I'm just going to give you a few tips on how to reduce your AI-related risks as you progress and perhaps start adopting AI within your organizations and how you perform your work. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So if we can move to the next slide, I'm sure many of you will, will recognize some of these tools, ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, something that you might not know so well, Read AI, and then of course Canva, which many organizations use nowadays for their marketing. By a show of hands, if you've got an angry face, if any of you have ever been in a meeting wondering what the heck this is, that is something that many of us experience, and many of us are quite a privacy and a confidentiality perspective. You know, Jason spoke about ethics and spoke about privacy and all your duties in that regard. And one of the most frustrating things is when you have this third-party app sitting in your meeting, recording and transcribing your information, and who knows where it's going and how it's going to be used. So those are the type of legal implications that arise out of tools like this, particularly Read is not so bad, but Otter AI that just pops in. Be careful about those. So the idea is to give you a few tips on how you can perhaps use these tools and at the same time avoid contravening your rules, the code, and your ethical obligations. Excuse me. If we can move on to the next slide. So here's the good news for all of you. As far as AI is concerned, we don't have an actual AI law in South Africa. We have something called a draft national AI framework. It's a pretty decent document, but perhaps before I tell you about it, we'll rewind a little. It was published for comment late last year, the framework. And before that, though, because we had quite a few tech-related events happening in the first half of 2024, a draft policy was put out that really was quite bad. And I think that the Department of Communications, which is responsible for this area of the law, was quite embarrassed by that. And it was really criticized, it was torn apart, it was really poorly drafted. So what they did was they came out with this new framework, which was a much better document, really good quality. It was lucid, you could understand what it was trying to convey. So this is not a law yet. It's a draft document that was put out for comment. Comments were closed in November. And what's happening now is the government is working through, or the Department of Communications is working through this draft framework and will likely publish a revised version with all the input from various people and come out with a better document. So what is this document? It's essentially a document that seeks to outline our wishes or what we want to achieve with AI. And it will likely turn into potentially regulations, or even, it uses this word, possibly an AI act or an AI piece of legislation. Now, I am a little skeptical about having an AI act too soon. There's so much going on. Different countries are in a state of transition and haven't decided what type of laws they are going to have. So my view, ideally, is that when this final framework comes out, it pushes for individual sectors to have their own regulations governing how that particular sector operates. So AI regulations in the health sector, the financial services sector, the legal sector, each one with a piece of legislation or a regulation that is focused on that particular sector, I think will be much better than an overarching act. That is sort of in line with some other countries like Singapore, Israel, Norway. They've all taken the approach where they have more regulations that are specific to a sector, as opposed to an AI act that covers a broad sphere or a broad range of issues. As Jason said in his discussion, what happens is that you have a law, and by the time the law is promulgated, it's a year or even 2 years. In this case, if we see another draft or the final version of this AI framework before the end of this year, then the department will need a pat on the back, because typically finalizing these types of white papers, policies, et cetera, take up to a year. So imagine if just the framework is going to take, potentially, if they work hard, another 6 months, it will be another 2 years before we have an act. And what do we do in the meantime? So my view is, let's start getting regulations in place. So we don't have an act, we have this framework. What else is there to give us guidance as far as AI is concerned? Well, some of you who have been keeping an eye on the draft King Code, King 5, will see that they have been quite proactive, and they've come out with a new Principle 9, that deals specifically with artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. What's interesting is, much like the EU AI Act, which I'll talk about shortly, there's this insistence that there always be a human in the loop, as the previous speakers have said. So if you have a chance, look at the draft code, and you'll see that it discusses and makes recommendations on what the governing body of an organization should take into account if it's going to be using these emerging technologies. So that one I found really interesting and quite exciting, because you can see that the King Code is keeping up to date with the way, with the times, if I can put it that way. So EU AI Act. Well, how does that apply to us? Well, the reality is that it's much like the GDPR. It has what they call the Brussels effect, and in certain instances, it stretches beyond the EU itself. Much like GDPR has extraterritorial or extra EU effect, the AI Act will also have an impact on businesses, organizations operating outside of the EU. How does that happen? Well, what it does is it defines what doesn't really define AI. There's no definition of artificial intelligence. What it does is it defines an AI system, which essentially is a system that infers certain decisions, if you want to call it that. But how does it apply to your organization if you are involved in the AI sector? Well, it says if you are using a piece of AI or deploying it in the European Union, if you are selling it there with a couple of other factors, then it's going to impact on you. So a South African business, or perhaps a South African audit firm that might have operations in the European Union that is deploying artificial intelligence, well, immediately you're going to be subject to the EU AI Act. So that is a broad overview of what laws or draft laws are currently in place and what you should be keeping an eye on. But in the meantime, while we wait for an AI law, if we can move on to the next slide. What are you to do as organizations that are starting to make use of and implement AI in your organizations? Well, there are other laws that actually will determine and have legal consequences for you if you are using AI tools, AI models, etc., within your organization. So the most important things that you will see both in the framework and in the King Code and also in the EU AI Act is concerns around privacy, data protection, cybersecurity, ethics, and a number of other items. So as far as privacy is concerned, of course, if you are collecting client data, if you are using that, now I'm straying into the techies territory in your models and using it to train data, I'm stepping in dangerous territory now. I'm not staying in my lane. But if you're taking data that belongs to your clients and you're using it in some of your models to train your models, the reality is, do you have permission to do that? Do you have permission to use that personal information? And remember, in South Africa, financial information is personal information as well. So do you have permission to use it? And if you don't, you're likely to be contravening privacy laws. So importantly, in using that type of information, get advice, get guidance on whether you can or cannot. And you'll see as we get towards the end, we'll give you some tips on how you can disclose to your clients and get permission to use personal information in the ways that we've just discussed. The other issue that comes up are issues of intellectual property. Again, you might be using certain information, you might even be using certain content that somebody else has created and incorporating it into what you do. Again, this is somebody's property that you are using, and the question you have to ask is, do I have the permission to do this? If you go out there and you just do a search online for AI intellectual property disputes, you'll see that there are tens and potentially hundreds of court cases going on against some of the suppliers, if I could call it that, like ChatGPT, Gemini, and even Copilot. You'll see that there are lots of copyright cases that are taking place right now because they've simply incorporated other people's intellectual property into their models and do not have permission. Of course, they argue that this is public information, it is available, and they're entitled to use it. So we're going to see what the outcome of these cases are as they wind through the system. And of course, Jason touched on this, so I won't go into any detail. But what are your ethical obligations in using AI? Have you considered whether the models that you or the tools that you are using are not biased? There's an interesting case that affected the Dutch Revenue Authority. In that instance, they used an artificial intelligence tool to identify people who are highly likely to engage in social benefits fraud. And they were quite proud of themselves because this tool was really accurate in identifying people, and they prosecuted these people, and many of them lost their entire life savings because, of course, they were accused of fraud, and the Revenue Authority basically sued them to recover the funds. But in time, after a non-governmental organization took over representation for some of these people, they were actually able to very clearly identify that the developers of this particular tool had incorporated certain biases, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and these biases identified more often than not people of North African descent. And of course, after some in-depth investigations, they were able to identify that this particular tool actually got a lot wrong. So what's critical is that you, in procuring and using these tools, make sure that you take these factors into account until, of course, we have a more comprehensive AI law, or, as I hope, more comprehensive sector-specific regulations that will apply to what it is that you as auditors do. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And again, I'm not going to stray into Jason's lane. He's dealt with this in a fair amount of detail, but you've got to look at what your code says and take into account aspects of professional competence, due care, confidentiality aspects, and of course, professional behavior. Jason touched on this in quite a bit of detail. And you'll see now that as we go into the next case study, which affected the legal profession, but is equally relevant to you, that these factors need to be taken into account in your everyday use of artificial intelligence tools. Integrity, objectivity, professional competence. Jason spoke about training and getting your people to understand the implications of certain tools is absolutely critical, because if you don't, you're opening yourself up to risks and liability, which we'll talk about shortly. But if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about this very interesting case that got a few lawyers into trouble. So this case related to a completely different issue. Mr. Mavundla and the MEC of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs in KZN were having a bit of a legal battle, and their legal representatives were really at loggerheads with each other. It so happened that Mr. Mavundla's lawyers decided that they were going to be quite cutting edge, and they decided to make use of one or other. It's never been disclosed which one it was, but one or other of the tools, whether it be ChatGPT or Copilot. But what happened was the lawyers arrived at court on the morning of the case, and the advocate was handed a bundle of documents, and the candidate legal practitioner from the law firm had spent a lot of time doing some research and producing what we call heads of argument, which is essentially summarized versions of your argument in court, and with supporting case law, etc. And the advocate very competently presented a very compelling case, citing amazing cases. And for those who don't know, lawyers base their arguments on prior decisions and prior judgments. So this advocate presented a compelling case and had 9 really brilliant examples or case studies that she used. The judge, of course, was really impressed, but being a judge of great experience, didn't recognize many of these cases that were being used to support the argument. So being a diligent judge, she went back to her chambers afterwards and requested some of her clerks to do some research. The clerks, of course, went out there and spent many hours trying to track down all these cases. And it turned out that of the 9 that were cited, only 2 existed. The others, of course, bore some resemblance to decided cases, but after some time, and if you looked at them, you could see that they were all slightly different to the proper citations. The judge asked her clerks to try and find these cases, and they couldn't, try as they might. So what the judge did was she reconvened court, and she asked the advocate to explain where she had found these cases and to present copies of them. Of course, the advocate and the candidate legal practitioner who had been assisting her said, well, we'll go and find the cases. They do, in fact, exist. But try as they might, they couldn't find these cases anywhere. They came back to court, and of course, the advocate insisted that the candidate legal practitioner had insisted that these cases existed, and somehow they had just disappeared from the legal research software that she had used. Of course, the judge, having been in practice for many years, was very skeptical and insisted, called the principal of the firm, and he himself insisted and backed up the candidate legal practitioner that she had in fact done proper research using a proper legal tool. Of course, it all became very, very gray, and the judge became extremely agitated at the fact that they were not disclosing and being quite frank with her. And what she then did was she referred all 3 to the Legal Practice Council. So what are the issues there? Incompetence, not knowing how to use a tool. The candidate legal practitioner had simply gone off to use a judge's term on a frolic of her own, to do her own research without authorization, without proper training. The advocate had simply taken the information at face value and had not presented, not taken due care to assess the authenticity of the information. And of course, the principal, the owner of the firm, perpetuated the lies, if you want to call it that, and insisted that he too knew that this information was genuine but could not find it. So the point is, in your day-to-day dealings, you've got to make sure that you understand what you do. Look at the 5 principles that were cited, that Jason cited on the previous slide, and make sure that you've implemented that within your organization. If we move to the next slide, I assume I have about a minute or 2 left, Rudolph. So what should you do in your organization to reduce your AI-related risks. What are the considerations that you need to take into account? Well, of course, there's privacy. Make sure that the tool that you're using contemplates these 4 issues: privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, and of course, ethics aspects. If you look at tools like Copilot Pro, for example, you'll see that if you've implemented that within your organization, which we are doing a trial with, it gives you the assurance. Look at the terms and conditions. It will have a little green tick and assures you that the information that you are using and inputting is within a closed system and will not be used by Microsoft or anyone else. Consider that. As far as your other considerations are concerned, procurement considerations. Think about how you or what tool you're procuring. Is it reputable? Does it give particular undertakings as far as those critical aspects, privacy, cybersecurity, etc.? Get indemnities in place in your terms and conditions with your clients, or get indemnities from the actual tool that you are using from the suppliers. Limit your liability and make sure that you're contracting both with the suppliers and your clients provides for all the risks that you're likely to encounter. Get permission from your client. Disclose to them that you're going to be using AI, because you don't want them to come back later and say, you didn't tell us. So take those issues into account as you start dealing with and procuring these tools. And lastly, if you don't follow these steps, you run regulatory risks. The regulators are going to come after you, whether it's the information regulator or one or other of the regulators that are out there. But might come after you as well. Reputational risks. Look at the law firm that I just mentioned. They're in big trouble, and very few clients are likely to use them again. And then lastly, revenue risks. Big fines come out of your own pocket, and that's not nice for any business. So if you take these issues into account, you're likely to reduce your risks as far as AI is concerned. And on that note, if we move to the next slide, if you have any questions, I don't know if we have time, Rudolf, but yeah, it's been great chatting to you. You'll find my details online, or I'll check if there are any questions in the chat.
I'll just pose one question for you, Lucien. I mean, it's interesting that Jason was just talking about the over-reliance and abuse of artificial intelligence. And now you're just giving us an example of how AI is also capable of generating a non-existent case. So I guess it's also important for us to interrogate the results that are produced by AI, not just to buy what it's selling to us. So my question for you, you raised an important point that South Africa does not have a legislative framework as yet, unlike our counterparts in the EU. So what are the implications of this not having an AI legislation, and how do you advise corporate South Africa to respond to that gap in legislation?
So I'm a proponent of light touch regulation. So when if there is an AI Act, I would want one that is very sort of high level and that directs regulations to specific sectors, sector-specific regulations on AI. It's going to be some time before we get an AI Act. So in the meantime, what I would encourage corporates, clients, audit firms to do is to consider those areas of the law that impact on AI. You know, I gave the examples of intellectual property, of privacy laws, of cybersecurity related laws. You know, there are quite a few guidelines that have been put out by various regulators on this in the financial services sector. Implement those and you're likely to reduce your risks. So yes, about 2 years before we see an act, Rudolf.
Thank you very much for the insights, Lucien. So can you please move to the next slide? Thank you very much. So we're now headed for a break. We will be taking a 15-minute comfort break. So we will resume at exactly 14:45. Thank you very much. Hope you get some refreshments and come back at 14:45. See you soon.